You are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Dan Bannock.
Five years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic, one of my very first guests on the show reflected on power, politics, and development in Latin America. A lot has changed since then. The debate about the global south has grown louder, great power competition has intensified, and new trade and technology alliances are reshaping how regions engage with one another. In addition, a climate agenda championed by the global north often appears to collide with the everyday realities of countries still struggling with poverty, high levels of inequality, and the demand for jobs and dignity. So it feels especially fitting to welcome back on the show my guest and colleague Benedicte, who is a professor of political science at the University of Oslo's Center for Global Sustainability. Benedicte has spent years studying Latin American politics, elites, and the region's evolving ties with the rest of the world. Based on a recent special issue of a journal that she and I co-edited, we explore a simple but slippery question. What precisely is the Global South in 2025? Is it a geographic label, a political stance, or a coalition of convenience? And why does Latin America's perspective matter for global development? The region has long been a laboratory for ideas that have later shaped global debates, from dependency theory to conditional cash transfers, and from resource governance to the politics of inequality. Its experience sits at the crossroads of many of today's challenges, navigating ties to both Washington and Beijing, managing critical minerals and rainforests, and confronting the enduring tension between economic growth and environmental stewardship. Latin America also reveals something important about how development is being redefined. Across much of the global north, policy language has shifted toward green transition and carbon goals. But in countries like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, citizens still demand safety, work, and reliable energy, while insisting that sustainability cannot come at the expense of livelihoods. Listening to Latin American perspectives helps us see how universal development ambitions are shaped and sometimes constrained by local, political, and social realities. Benedicte and I also touch on the growing influence of China in the region, how trade, investment, and diplomacy have altered old alignments, and how local industries are adapting to a new era of global competition. These shifts tell us something really important about the future of development. Who gets to grow, who sets the rules, and whose priorities shape the global agenda. And before we begin, I want to say how much I value hearing from you. Your feedback and reflections help shape the direction of this podcast and the conversations we choose to feature. If you enjoy this episode, please share it with friends, students, or colleagues who might find it thought-provoking. And help spread the word about the show, rate it, recommend it, and keep the dialogue alive. I'm Dan Bannock, and you are listening to In Pursuit of Development. I'm particularly glad to see you here in my studio because you were one of my first guests when I started this podcast. That's 5 years ago when the pandemic was in full swing and how things have changed. So it's lovely to see you and welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here in this basement again. I've seen you frequently in the office, of course, but not here in a while.
You've been working extensively on China, on Latin America. Give us a little sense of how the global south or the rise of this block of countries is playing out, say, in Latin America.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to follow that. And the first thing I would like to mention is that I'm on a research council in Chile evaluating social science proposals. And it's so striking how almost every proposal includes a sort of reference to Chile as a global south country. And then I'm asking, so what do you really mean by that? How does Chile have more in common with, say, Nigeria or Thailand or any other country that you would think of grouping into that than a global north country? And so I think the real phenomenon here is in part the increased use of that term. It's as if so many people around the world have wanted a new term to use for something that they feel is important.
You mean to replace developing third world, which was always a bit politically not acceptable perhaps, and so global south sounds better?
I think global south, I think it sounds better. It doesn't have all those connotations. Well, third world is an anachronism. It doesn't, since the second doesn't exist anymore. Developing country, I think, is also increasingly used. We when we studied, we learned that, this is an old term that's kind of condescending. We shouldn't use it. And now it's back in full. But also the global south phenomena. And of course, it is a reflection of changing realities to some extent. But I think there's also something about the language here that has really caught on.
Going back to the identity of the Global South, so I was in a panel 3 days ago with a former Chilean ambassador to China, and he felt that China was not a Global South actor, that China does not qualify as a Global South country. And I found that very fascinating because in a lot of the work that you and I have done, but also in my previous work, I noticed that for China, it's very important to be grouped as part of the Global South. And here I wonder whether the Latin American identity is somewhat different from, say, Asians and Africans, because if I'm not wrong, there's more of a feeling that Latin America is more Western, or the Western part of the Global South, and is not necessarily as anti-West, it's more sort of closer to the West and the North than they are to the South. And this creates some sort of tension. I'm seeing, at least in some of the literature. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, in this special issue, in the introduction, we outline 5 different understandings of the Global South. So, of course, it's not clear. It's not a geographical term. It is more kind of a political term. And I would say Latin America is very divided on that term. Because as I imagine that ambassador was alluding to, they're trying, at least a group of intellectuals, politicians are trying to sort of create this idea of active non-alignment, that it's possible to be non-aligned both from China and from the US. Of course, that is complicated if you see yourself as a part of the Global South and also China as a part of the Global South. You cannot be non-aligned from China if China is a part of your sort of own group. So I think that is a part of the issue. But so the Global South sort of involves kind of a political agenda. It involves decolonization at many different levels. It involves a stronger, a bigger place for Global South countries in the world. And that is also political. And it is difficult to delineate who are they against, who are they for, in a way. And in Latin America, I would say it's also, everything tends to come down to right wing, left wing in Latin America, or lots of things. And it's definitely a term that some of the more progressive left-wing countries are using, like Brazil, like Chile, Colombia at the moment, sometimes also Mexico, but they're very, very cautious in kind of to develop a discourse that alienate is that sort of that is too hostile towards the US.
Yes, so it's almost like for some countries, adopting the Global South in foreign policy is almost rejecting alliances with Western partners, etc., right? So they're worried that it is about picking sides.
Exactly. And also, it's also about Europe. And you know, Latin America is Western in any geographical sense. It's dominated by European culture, which is Western. So it's hard to say that Latin America is not a part of the West, and that is why they're arguing for this kind of multiple identities. It doesn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to pick sides. It's more about some values. It's
So
about
is it
some
easier?
ideas.
Is it easier for Maduro to say that, Venezuela is part of the global south? Is it easier for Ecuador or Bolivia rather than Chile or Argentina? I know that Lula has been talking more and more about the global south, and I was looking at a recent article, this is also part of our special issue, where one tracks the number of speeches where development and south are mentioned, and this is increased dramatically since Lula came back in the last few years, whereas Bolsonaro was not talking about it. So again, it goes back to this left or right. It's about political leanings and maybe how one sees the world. So is it right to say that it is better or easier for Lula now and Brazil to talk more about the global south and identify itself with India and China than it is for many other, maybe, large but also well-off countries? Whereas for the smaller, maybe somewhat poorer countries, the global south identity is easier to embrace.
Yeah, I think the contrast here would be Argentina, Brazil's neighboring country, now led by Javier Milei, an ultra right-wing president who's very much allied with the Trump administration. So he would never talk about the global south. That will be seen as something on the left. He does, however, strengthen the relationship with China, sort of at the economic and more sort of basic level. They cannot cut the ties to China because it's so important. But at the discursive level, it's definitely more kind of being aligned with the US. So I think it's probably easier to use those words to establish strongly that discourse for a country like Brazil. It could also be for Mexico, and you see that. But Mexico is always Mexico always has to think about the reactions from the US. They're so much closer to the US.
So is it always about China? Is that the defining moment? Because I know you've been doing a lot of work on China in Latin America, and even though there are fewer of these big mega projects that we've seen on the African continent, China is a dominant player, is becoming, or is the major trading partner for many countries in Latin America. And so while the historical traditions would make some leaders or countries more aligned with the United States or feel more sympathetic with the West, the economic reality now is often tied very closely with trade and investments with and from China.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And that is especially true for South America, not so much for Mexico, that has over 80% of its trade with the US because of the USMCA, the trade agreement that they have with the US. But for the rest of the countries, China is an indispensable economic partner. It's trade, it is investments. They have not been huge over the last years, but it used to be big loans. That has kind of dried up. But it is strategic investments. It's in renewables. It's in more technological sectors. So China is there. And sort of my angle to studying all this is always sort of studying the elites. And it used to be the case that it was kind of the left-wing politicians that were approaching China, with a couple of exceptions like Chile, where you had the fruit growers and the wine producers that were trading with China since back to the dictatorship time of Pinochet. But in the rest of the countries, it was kind of more of a left-leaning agenda. That is history.
Because the traditional elites were more aligned with the United States.
More aligned with the United States, very closely integrated even with U.S. elites. And they often had their education from the U.S. but that has changed. Not that they're not integrated with U.S. elites, but the economic interest of the elites is much more in China.
What happened? What happened? How did China? How was China able to convert these elites from being, say, pro-American? They may still hold pro-American views, but in terms of investments, joint ventures, these Latin American elites have been interacting with Chinese companies.
Absolutely, yes. And I think it's at two levels. One is that they opened up their markets for a number of Latin American products. China now has 5 or 6 free trade agreements with Latin American countries, and they have been pushing that. They've been much more kind of active in initiating collaboration, while the U.S. historically has had trade agreement with most of the countries, but nothing has happened over the last 20 years, basically, or maybe a little bit less, but very little has happened in terms of opening new opportunities in the US. And the Chinese have come with investments. They've been interested. So it's the economic opportunities for the elites. And lots of these elites are not exporting things, they're importing. And they create, they strike deals with Chinese producers, and it's become a lot easier also to trade with China for many reasons, including technology, infrastructure, etc. And then I think you also have the sort of the more diplomatic level. In the U.S., they're treated as nobodies. If you come to China, they're welcome. They're offered sort of big seminars, meetings. They're treated as celebrities when you come to. Well, you've experienced that. You've been treated like a celebrity too. It is a different feeling, and there's doors open. So I think that has converted a lot of elites, and now of course China is increasingly investing in like they've done in Africa for a long time, in giving them, now I'm thinking Spanish becas, but it's stipends to go to study. Yeah. They're inviting different groups of people to get to know China.
But that is also my take, is that, and there's been quite a lot of work on relational power. China has been exceptionally good at building relations. I mean, from a diplomatic perspective, I think they've been far superior than many other Western actors, because whether they mean it or not, at least the perception in recipient countries is they're genuine. They're inviting us when Europe is saying, don't come to study. Schengen visa is very difficult, China's saying, come, we'll give you this and workshops and this and that, to media, to judges, you name it. The PLA has had close ties the Chinese Communist Party has built in Africa. So I think a lot of Western powers, have underestimated the slow but steady building up of China's relational power. I wanted to touch upon something that I know both of us are interested in, and this show is about development. And what fascinates me, Benedicte, about the rise of the Global South is, you may or may not agree with me, but I feel that one way in which this very heterogeneous group has mobilized themselves into whatever bloc, whether it's BRICS or G20 of late, is this idea that we want development in the Global South. The Global North does not respect our needs to develop, to reduce poverty. We have huge challenges. They say, we're not against climate policies. Of course, we are facing the brunt of climate change, but you guys are talking about very high-level stuff, that affects your countries. But in terms of financing for development, for sustainable development, for loss and damage, you guys are still very stingy. You've historically polluted the world, and now you're just asking us to pay or stop doing what we were doing. And so I feel that some of this is playing out in the G20 declarations, that Brazil was had the presidency last year. South Africa this year. India was very keen on promoting African perspectives, invited the AU to be a member of the G20. So one of the many reasons why we are seeing the rise of the Global South is this general dissatisfaction with how the world has performed. Multilateralism has perhaps failed, according to some of these countries. Is that also your take, let's say, from Latin America, that countries, leaders, elites are feeling a bit let down by the liberal Western world order, and there is a longing or a hunger for change, new institutions? That is at least how I see in China and India.
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating to observe what's going on in India and China. I think India has something that's very much in common with what is happening in Latin America. And they do have some kind of structural features in common, including...
Like with Brazil, right?
With Brazil, high levels of inequality, but still a pretty solid industrial base. They have very strong elites and all that. So I think, there's some of that in Latin America, but I think it's less. And I think, again, the Latin Americans they're too preoccupied with fighting among themselves. It's a lot of the rage is directed towards their own elites and not towards the global institutions. Not in all cases. I mean, you find that discourse definitely also in Latin America, but I feel sort of the overall kind of the strong antipathies are directed towards their own elites.
Even in Argentina, which has had these recurrent debt problems.
Even in Argentina, because you see now with this new, it's not so new anymore, as the Javier Milei, who's there to sort of definitely a deep critique of IMF and all of that. But the main targets of his criticism is the Peronist party, sort of the Peronists and that other part of the elite that he doesn't belong to. That's kind of the big enemy of Javier Milei and his movement. In Venezuela, that's been sort of through this deep, extreme crisis. Of course, the sort of anger of the people is directed towards their own government. That has been, in large part, a part of it. So I feel this kind of drive towards changing the world is maybe not so strong, because they're pretty much concerned with changing their own governments and also reducing the dependency, particularly on the US, seen from the left side, while the right side has a completely different agenda.
What about development? Is the anger towards local elites, is it because of lack of development? To what extent does development figure in these debates?
It does, and I think this issue of the environment is very interesting that you raised. Sort of, we both work at what's now Center for Global Sustainability. It used to be the Center for Development and the Environment. It says a lot that how the agenda here in the global north has shifted. We look at sort of the green transition. We don't speak much about development anymore.
We don't.
And I think in this whole global debate on geopolitics, on climate, green transition, development has kind of lost, sort of at the same time as the global south has become stronger and raised that issue in the global north. Who talks about development? I hear it very, very little. And so that has definitely been a big debate in Latin America, and there's been innovations on environmental sort of politics to a great extent in many countries. But that has also, so it's a bit of a different debate, because that has to some extent come from indigenous groups that have alternative lifestyles that are against the sort of aggressive development by their own elites that are kind of ruining the rainforest, the land, etc. But I think that this global climate agenda has kind of lost a bit of credibility among a lot, also in parts of Latin America, and that started before Trump. But of course, when the leader of the West, well, we don't like it, but the US is still the strongest power among the West, can just switch everything from one day to another, sort of. So we don't care anymore either.
Who's setting the agenda is the issue. I actually quite like what the foreign minister of India once said a few years ago. Why is it always that Europe's problems are our problems, but our problems are never Europe's problems? Yeah. I think there is that common perception. I'm not saying it's agreed to by everyone in many parts of the global south, that their problems don't get the attention. That it is always climate. And I'm not saying climate is not a problem. It is a huge problem, but people are struggling to survive today. And so it is that extreme poverty, it is surviving till tomorrow that concerns them. And they're not saying that they don't sort of support the global climate agenda, but provide us with money, for having polluted historically. And that's where the West is failing, in their view.
Absolutely. And that is definitely, I mean, the West is failing also poor countries in Latin America, no doubt. And I think one thing that may be bothering Latin Americans more than other kind of global South country is the dependence on the dollar, and that has been one of the sort of topics of the BRICS, of course, also for Brazil and its leadership in G20 and others. And it's something that is it's this simple fact that their whole economy, they can plan, they can do everything right, and then the currency depreciates and everything is turned upside down from one day to another. And of course, that creates an incredible vulnerability for many of those countries. And then you have the US fighting back with all its means against it. So it's the feeling, the sort of feeling that any sense of justice has just disappeared in this sort of global economy. And it used to be, at least, that the global north, at least, it never did enough. It never really changed its policy to accommodate the needs of the global south, but there were at least something happening.
They were making symbolic gestures. Now even that has disappeared.
Exactly. Now even that has disappeared. I mean, yeah, open borders for goods from the poorest countries. I mean, yeah, it didn't make a huge difference for us here in Norway, but at least it was a kind of gesture. Now everything is sort of thrown overboard, and I think it's really scary. And that is part of the popularity of the idea of the global south, because it is a way of trying to reintroduce some sense of justice in a world that's driven by geopolitical concerns.
It's important to highlight here that not everything is fine and dandy with this global south. And I've been making the argument in various forums that there's so much internal disagreement, infighting, think of India, China, think about Russia trying to portray itself as a global south actor. Isn't that interesting? I mean, that would be a big problem for the global south if Russia suddenly is accepted as being a global south player.
And they're trying. So they're talking about the global majority, because everybody sees that an imperial country in the very north of the world, nobody's going to accept that they're a part of the global south, but they can start talking about the global majority and sort of gain some kind of legitimacy based on that, which is even less possible to define.
Exactly. But there's another challenge with this global south, or this bloc, is that you have these big actors. Like Brazil is trying to be, not perhaps explicitly as a leader of the global south, but it, I'm sure, harbors some ambitions, even though it does not have the hard power maybe to match China. Same with India, so everybody's trying to somehow be the leader of the region or leader of the bloc. But the criticism is that the smaller countries, perhaps their interests are not always represented by these big countries. They have their own interests at heart. So, what are the incentives for India and China or Brazil to push also for the interests of smaller countries? And so there's a lot of that. But I wanted to stay on this issue of development, Benedicte. We just discussed earlier about how Latin America or elites have moved quite a lot towards China in terms of aid and investments. The question is whether that has promoted greater development in the region. Economic development is the most important justification in many ways for China's intervention on the African continent. At least African elites use that, saying that without China, we would not have had infrastructure because the West wasn't building infrastructure. So without China, we would not have had many of these industries, energy projects, you name it. Is that also the case in Latin America, or are there other interests at play, not just development?
Yeah, to take the first issue first, and I think the judges are still out on that. Sort of how does it really impact development? There's overall quantitative studies that have tried to measure the impact on economic growth, for example. They haven't really been able to find much. But me and a colleague, Antolio Rosales, we did a sort of in-depth study of Venezuela, which is a very special case. It's a oil-rich country. It's been through an economic disaster. It's been exposed to really hard sanctions from the U.S. that have crippled their economy, in addition to the terrible economic policies that crippled it from the start. But China has also been an active player in Venezuela, first through large loans, through two big kind of funds that were supposed, with Chinese funding, that were supposed to fund industrial development in Venezuela. After that, basically kind of collapsed. They have become involved in many different other ways. Now they're trying to create special economic zones on the model of what they do have themselves in parts of China, with smaller investment. But we sort of looked at very sort of traditional indicators of development, being first kind of industrialization, diversification, and and institutionalization, using sort of the good old developmental state theory. And we found that China actually contributed to the opposite. First, through kind of requiring non-transparency. Venezuela was already a country with large transparency issues, but it led to a kind of weaker institutions in many ways. It has not led to industrialization or diversification. And the sort of the little, in terms of investments that's coming now, is there to basically facilitate the importation of Chinese industrialized goods while they're deepening the dependency on their oil resources. So it's kind of development in reserve. We call it structural stagnation rather than development.
Don't you think Venezuela is perhaps the exception?
I think it's an extreme case, and we also discussed that in depth. But the issue of industrialization, I think, is rather general, because China is developing infrastructure. There are investments, but at the end of the day, the export of Chinese goods is increasing across the developing world of Chinese industrialized goods, and they buy raw material. There's some exceptions to that pattern in terms of technology. There's in Chile, they're now investing in not only in the lithium production, for example, but also a battery factory. So there's exceptions, but the overall picture, and I think that is actually just going to get worse in the current situation with higher tariffs across the board, that the Chinese have an incredible overcapacity on industrialized goods that they're exporting also to the poorer countries. And to see the poorer countries developing their own industries in that relationship is very hard.
I think that is a very good point. I was reading recently an analysis about electric vehicles in Brazil. So Brazil, apparently, most of the cars that are being sold now are electric, and they are largely from China. While this is good in terms of environment, like, pollution control, climate, etc., it is not so good for local manufacturing. And this is a big issue, I know, in many African countries, where as much as people like cheap medicines from India, infrastructure, cars or whatever from Asia, even these really old second-hand cars, third-hand cars from Japan that are highly polluting, the major criticism is that very little is produced. So manufacturing capacity, and this is also criticism of the Global South or South-South cooperation, that it's fine that you guys have technology transfers, etc., give us goods and services, but you have to produce more stuff here. The reaction I hear from Indians and Chinese companies is that, well, the market is so small, we won't really make a profit. It is cheaper for locals to buy goods that are shipped from China than produced, locally. Is that something that you also see? I mean, Brazil is certainly feeling the pinch. I'm told that there is a huge demand for manufacturing Chinese electric cars, but not just importing it from China.
Yeah, I think that is a tendency I see in many of these countries in Latin America. They didn't have a large industrial base to start with. That was sort of an experiment in the sort of 60s and 70s with import substituting industrialization. But so Brazil is kind of an exception. It's both a commodity exporter and an industrialized country in many ways. But in some of the others, they didn't have that much to start with. But I just see the possibilities of building some kind of local industries are minimal at the current now. The interesting case here is, of course, Mexico, because Mexico it really changed its economy in the 1990s as a result of what was then NAFTA, the NAFTA agreement with the U.S., building up its car industry, its manufacturing industry to export to the U.S. That has been a major, which was a U.S. initiative to start with, and then the whole pushback from Trump. But they are also, they have also for a while been establishing closer ties with China. So China has invested in Mexico to a large part to establish industry there to export to the U.S. That will, of course, be ended with the current policy, depending on how it ends up, of course. But you can also see that the result will be a tougher future for Mexico's industry. And with China, with all its overcapacity and openness for exporting to Mexico at the same time, it's hard to see that changes in any other way than negatively in the future.
You know, when I was in China last year, it was the first time after the pandemic. I hadn't been there for 4 years and things have changed so dramatically. But in most of the discussions I was having, overcapacity, overproduction was always mentioned, because this is the criticism from the US and from the European Union, and even the EU is worried that the German car industry is going to collapse. I think I read a statement from Mercedes-Benz, the CEO, saying the EU should not stop producing, fossil fuel cars after 2030 or something, because that's where they feel they have their expertise, because they fear that the EVs from China are too good and the whole car industry in Europe is going to die. So I understand that there is a concern in our parts of the world. Our jobs are perhaps at stake, but from a sustainable development, from a climate perspective, one has to accept that cheap solar panels from China are making a huge difference. Cheaper, very good cars from China are making a huge difference. And that, I think, is also part of this problem in the global south. They say, you guys are talking about climate, but when we are providing solutions, you don't like it. It's a lot of hypocrisy.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, in the sort of solar panel business and sort of the EV supply chain, I mean, we just have to accept that we cannot do it without China. There's no doubt. I think also most people that are, you have to to balance things, but I mean, it's impossible to do this without China because they're so dominant in so many, and especially, of course, on solar panels. So we have to think of other ways of limiting our dependence. I think we could learn something from Latin America to try to limit our dependence on every
exactly. And I'm just thinking about development theory, dependency theory, the origins in Latin America. Are there new ideas coming on development from Latin America? Are there any major approaches that are being promoted? I'm thinking historically the conditional cash transfers, which is sort of Mexico, Brazil. They pioneered this and it's now a global phenomena. Do you see other development approaches that are originating in Latin America that could be scaled up in other parts of the world?
Well, the ideas that are now being exported from Latin America are not exactly developmental, but it's more on security. And it's more the sort of the hard fist policies, the pushing liberal rights to the side to centralize control in order to crack down on crime and bring kind of peace and security. It's not on development, but I'm just saying that those are the days. Of course, Nayib Bukele of El Salvador is the face of many of those ideas, but there's people and politicians trying to copy those across the region. So it's a kind of a right-wing agenda, libertarian thinking in some ways, but also very authoritarian and very conservative. And so it's definitely not developmental, but it is also an idea that is what can bring kind of peace and prosperity to the country. So it's extremely different from what we've been discussing over the last years with cash transfer, also some of those kind of strategies to live in harmony with nature. There are certain different ideas that sort of how to create better lives. So in terms of the more kind of progressive developmental policies, is there anything remarkable that comes out of Latin America at the moment? I can't really think of much.
Ecuador's constitution, talking about climate and...
That's just seems like distant past. We now have
it's been a while.
It's been a while. And of course, that is still, the constitution is still there. There's been some referendums on the protection of particular parts, but the main concern for most Ecuadorians at the moment is one, violence and crime and drug trafficking, with the famous banana boxes that is shipped out of Guayaquil that we even get here with cocaine. And it's also, it is to some extent development because it's also about sort of energy shortages. And that has been a big issue. But the big debates are about violence and corruption.
But that also explains why Bukele has become so popular. And not just there. Even in this country, our children, my son is telling me, Dad, look at this video, Bukele. He's so popular. He's, being tough on crime and thinking about the history, sometimes the painful history of Latin America with dictatorships. Many of them justified their rule by this law and order approach that I'm here not to take over your power. I know I'm not democratically elected, but I will make sure your property rights are taken care of. You live in peace and harmony. And it seems to me that Bukele has been promoting that narrative very successfully and these ideas are popular in the United States.
Yeah, it's
the prison system. I mean, imagine sending our prisoners to Bukele. A bit like what the UK was doing. They wanted an agreement with Rwanda to send asylum seekers there. So it's like something weird is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I started to work with gangs in El Salvador in 1997. That's a while ago. Yeah. And it's very hard to come from outside and criticize the situation. There's just people that have not been able to walk on the streets, or kids that have been enshrined in a small apartment their whole childhood because they couldn't play football outside or do anything. And small businesses that have been extorted. We studied extortion in detail a few years back. And so, of course, yeah, if you just stop worrying about anything, stop worrying about rule of law, any kind of human rights, liberal rights, you can do things. And I think it's important to remember that most dictators have been really popular at one point, because they have come there to solve some problems, and people have felt those problems as maybe the most important problems in their lives. And that's what Bukele is doing. I do not want to think about what El Salvador looks like in 10 years from now, because with this policy of just incarcerating people, no process, nothing. I've talked to lots of people that know people that are inside, and they have nothing to do with the gangs. They know that they will probably never hear from them again. And also, they're creating a new clan. It's kind of a new elite, a new clan, Bukele and his brothers and his closest confidants. And they're becoming the new elite that are they're going to rule El Salvador for decades, I think.
How popular is Bukele in the rest of the region?
I think some people are scared of him, but many people want their own Bukele. And that has been a rhetoric of many politicians across the region. Of course, El Salvador had some very particular conditions with 3 very organized gangs that he made a deal with. It's very small. It's a tiny little country. Drug trafficking has never been such an issue. And I think that is a big difference from countries like Mexico and Colombia, that they were living off of a little bit of drug dealing, but not the big shipments. So the gangs they were not that rich as they were in many other places. They are in many other places. So it's a very particular case, but the discourse, it's selling, no doubt.
You and I have studied multilateralism or reformed or the attempt by many of these global South actors to reform multilateralism, especially China. And as you know, Benedicte, some of the debates have to do with this dissatisfaction with existing institutions. There's always something about reform of the UN, reform of the World Bank, reform of the IMF, reform of all the multilateral development agencies, the World Trading System. And this dissatisfaction leads many of these global South actors to try and create new institutions. Some of them have been relatively successful at a regional level, have not necessarily replaced the major Western-led multilateral institutions. Others at a bilateral level have done well. I'm thinking about China, Africa, the FOCAC. cooperation arrangements. You've had something similar, CELAC in Latin America. But the criticism has been that these have not necessarily all been very effective, that the Global South hasn't achieved that total transformation. Institution building has been a big challenge. I'd like to hear your thoughts while we conclude this conversation on the ability, as you see, going forward, of some of these Global South actors to really reform institutions, create new institutions, and maybe even leave some of these Western-led institutions, which they feel is fundamentally unfair.
Now it's the US that's leaving a lot of those institutions.
Indeed, yeah.
So whatever will become of those, that's even more uncertain in this right now than it was a few years back. So it's natural. I think we have to acknowledge that to build new institutions internationally is really difficult. Most of the countries in Latin America, they do not have very strong ministries of foreign affairs. Most of them are just kicked out when there's a new government that's elected. And that a lot of the experts are there just for a short while. They don't have a huge capacity. There's exceptions, like especially Mexico, Brazil, and Chile, I would say. But it is hard because they are mostly concerned with their domestic agendas, and they have not much time or resources to spend on foreign policy, let alone building new institutions. I think what you see now is that you create a lot of parallel forums. But I don't think we should dismiss their potential in actually being important for, maybe not for kind of changing the world, but for specific issue areas. BRICS has been the target of a lot of criticism. And of course, the lofty declarations is much more than what they're actually able to do.
I thought they were dead a few years ago and they suddenly have resurrected.
Ooh, here they are again. But I mean, they have created a new development bank. They have created different sort of currency swap arrangements, the possibility of trading in different currencies than the dollar, although they won't create their own currency or anything. So I think these are small maybe, but still important issues. And the fact that they're moving towards these kind of concrete issues, and at least beyond the sort of group photo and the summitry, I think is important. And I think it's important that I've been a bit kind of, Norway, where we are, we're not very much engaged with Latin America, apart from some very specific topics on peace in Colombia and negotiations in Venezuela and rainforest in Brazil,
exactly.
period. But the EU is now trying to establish a more kind of institutionalized relationship with Latin America. And I think that is actually really important, but we should also be really self-critical in doing that and patient. Self-critical on a lot of our own shortcomings when it comes to the global institutions. And I think the symbolic issue here is, of course, Gaza, where we're kind of violating all our values, all our sort of decency and civilization. Kind of the rest of the Western civilization is kind of going down the drain every day in Gaza. We need to to take that into account and be a bit humble, I think, in approaching Latin America, being humble, long-termist, and generous to create sort of joint institutions. So that is what I'm thinking. There's going to be a new summit between EU and CELAC in Colombia this fall. And I think that is something that, the EU doesn't really spend many minutes every day thinking about that. But I think it's worthwhile doing. And also in the relationship to other parts of the world, because we cannot claim to be the guardians of what we used to call Western values. We need to find allies across the world that share our values. And that includes India to a significant extent. Nobody ever totally agrees, but includes India with their long-term democracy, with lots of different flaws and problems and all that. But who doesn't have that? It includes Brazil, I think. It includes most of Latin America and many other actors in the Global South. Well,
we'll have to leave it at that. Always a pleasure chatting with you, Benedicte.
Likewise.
Thank you so much for coming on my show.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Bannock from the University of Oslo. Please email your questions, comments and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.